The morning sun cast long shadows across the ambulance station as Anthony Rodriguez wiped down the medical equipment in the back of Unit 17. His partner, Deshawn Miller, was finishing up paperwork from their previous call, an elderly woman who had fallen in her bathroom. It had been a relatively quiet shift so far, which always made Deshawn a little nervous. In his 15 years as a paramedic, the quietest mornings often gave way to the most chaotic afternoons. "You think we'll make it to lunch today?" Anthony asked, organizing the supplies in the medical cabinet. Deshawn looked up from his clipboard and smiled. "Man, don't jinx us. I've been craving that curry place all week." Both men had been partners for nearly 7 years with Metro Emergency Services. They had a rhythm to their work, a silent understanding that had saved countless lives over the years. Anthony, with his meticulous attention to detail, always made sure their ambulance was perfectly stocked and organized. Deshawn, with his calm demeanor even in the most stressful situations, could talk anyone through their worst day. The radio crackled to life, breaking the morning calm. "Unit 17, we have a priority 1 call. 10-year-old male in anaphylactic shock at 1428 Oak Ridge Lane in the Hillcrest neighborhood. Patient is having difficulty breathing. Parents on scene." Deshawn grabbed the radio. Unit 17 responding. ETA approximately 7 minutes. Anthony was already in the driver's seat before Deshawn finished speaking. They exchanged a quick glance. A child in anaphylactic shock meant every second counted. The ambulance roared to life, sirens wailing as they pulled out of the station. Anthony navigated through morning traffic with practiced precision, while Deshawn reviewed the protocol for pediatric anaphylaxis, though he knew it by heart. "Hillcrest," Anthony said, making a sharp turn onto the main road. "That's that fancy new development, right?" Deshawn nodded. "Yeah, $1 million homes. Never been called there before." As they raced toward the address, Deshawn's mind went through the possible scenarios. Anaphylactic shock in a child usually meant a severe allergic reaction, most commonly to food, insect stings, or medications. The dispatcher mentioned the parents were on scene, which was good. They would need information quickly. "You thinking food allergy?" Anthony asked, as if reading his partner's mind. "Most likely. Peanuts, tree nuts, or shellfish would be my guess. Kids that age, parents usually know about allergies already, so it might be accidental exposure." Anthony weaved through an intersection, the traffic parting for their emergency lights. 7 minutes might be too long. "Just get us there," Deshawn replied, his voice steady despite the urgency. "I've got the epinephrine ready to go." Both men fell silent, focused on the task ahead. They had treated anaphylaxis many times before, but cases involving children always carried extra weight. Deshawn thought about his own nephew, just a year younger than their patient. The personal connection didn't cloud his judgment. If anything, it sharpened his focus. The GPS directed them into the Hillcrest neighborhood, where perfectly manicured lawns stretched before large, stately homes. It was a stark contrast to the neighborhood where they had started their shift that morning. "It should be at the end of this block," Anthony said, slowing the ambulance as they approached the address. They pulled up to a large 2-story colonial with a circular driveway. A woman ran out the front door waving frantically, her face streaked with tears. "He's inside. Please hurry," she called as Anthony and Deshawn jumped out of the ambulance. Deshawn grabbed the emergency kit while Anthony followed with the stretcher. They moved with practiced efficiency. No wasted motions, no wasted seconds. Inside the house, they found a boy lying on the kitchen floor. His face was swollen, lips blue-tinged, and he was making a high-pitched wheezing sound with each labored breath. A man knelt beside him, his hand gripping his son's smaller one. "He ate a cookie," the man explained rapidly as the paramedics knelt beside the child. "We didn't know it had nuts. His EpiPen, we couldn't find it at first. We used it just before calling you. But he's still struggling." Deshawn nodded, immediately assessing the boy's condition while Anthony prepared additional equipment. The child's airways were constricting despite the epinephrine the parents had administered. "What's his name?" Deshawn asked, placing an oxygen mask over the boy's face. "Tyler," the mother answered, her voice trembling. Deshawn leaned closer to the child. "Tyler, I'm Deshawn. We're going to help you breathe better, okay? You're doing great." The boy's eyes, wide with fear, locked onto Deshawn's. There was a slight nod of understanding. "His blood pressure is dropping," Anthony reported quietly, having wrapped a cuff around the boy's arm. Deshawn made a quick decision. We need to administer another dose of epinephrine and get him to Memorial Children's right away. His airways are still closing. As Deshawn prepared the injection, Anthony explained to the parents what was happening. The first EpiPen helped, but he needs additional treatment. We're going to stabilize him here and then transport him immediately. Will he? The mother couldn't finish the question. We're doing everything we can, Anthony assured her, his tone confident without making promises he couldn't keep. Tyler's young and strong. That's in his favor. Deshawn administered the second dose of epinephrine while Anthony established an IV line with practiced efficiency. Both men communicated with short phrases and nods, the shorthand of partners who trusted each other completely. Pulse is stabilizing, Deshawn noted after a minute. Breathing is still labored but improved. The parents watched anxiously as the paramedics worked. Outside, neighbors had begun to gather on the sidewalk, drawn by the flashing lights of the ambulance. Let's move him now, Deshawn decided, seeing that Tyler's condition had improved enough for transport. We need to get him to the hospital for further treatment. They carefully transferred the boy onto the stretcher. His breathing was still difficult, but the deadly wheezing had subsided somewhat. The swelling in his face remained severe. One of you can ride with us, Anthony told the parents as they wheeled Tyler toward the door. I'll come, the father said immediately. Honey, can you follow in the car? The mother nodded, already grabbing her purse and keys. As they emerged from the house, Deshawn noticed several onlookers had gathered near their ambulance. Most kept a respectful distance, but he could see the curiosity in their expressions. The emergency vehicle was clearly an unusual sight in this quiet, affluent neighborhood. They loaded Tyler into the back of the ambulance, his father climbing in beside Deshawn, while Anthony closed the doors and headed for the driver's seat. We'll be at Memorial Children's in about 12 minutes, Deshawn explained as he continued to monitor Tyler's vital signs. They already have a team waiting for us. The father nodded, his eyes never leaving his son's face. Thank you. I don't know what we would have done if you did the right thing using the EpiPen and calling us immediately, Deshawn interrupted gently. That quick action gave Tyler the best chance. As the ambulance pulled away from the curb, sirens once again blaring, Deshawn continued to check Tyler's oxygen levels and heart rate. The boy's eyes remained open, still frightened but a bit more focused now. Deshawn gave him an encouraging smile. You're doing great, buddy, he said, adjusting the oxygen mask. Just keep taking those breaths for me. What none of them knew as they sped toward the hospital was that one of those curious neighbors had made a phone call, a call that would turn this emergency into something far more complicated than a medical crisis. But for now, in the back of Unit 17, all that mattered was keeping Tyler breathing until they reached the hospital. The radio crackled as Anthony communicated their status to the emergency room. Deshawn checked Tyler's vitals once more, relieved to see continued improvement. The epinephrine was working, but the boy would need further treatment and observation. Has this happened before? Deshawn asked the father. Once when he was 5, the man replied, his voice steadier now. But it wasn't this severe. We've been so careful since then. Deshawn nodded. Allergic reactions can sometimes get worse with each exposure. The doctors will probably want to adjust his emergency plan after this. As they navigated through traffic, Deshawn kept one eye on his patient and one on the road ahead. 15 years on the job had taught him that the journey to the hospital was often as critical as the initial treatment. He had seen too many cases where patients stabilized only to crash minutes later, but Tyler seemed to be holding his own. His color was improving, and while his breathing was still labored, the desperate gasping had subsided. Neither Anthony nor Deshawn could have predicted what awaited them at their destination. For now, they were simply doing what they had trained for, saving a life, one careful decision at a time. The ambulance sped through the last intersection before Memorial Children's Hospital, sirens cutting through the morning traffic. In the back, Deshawn continued monitoring Tyler's vitals while speaking softly to both the boy and his father. We're almost there, Deshawn assured them. About 3 more minutes. Tyler's breathing had improved, but his face remained swollen and hives had spread across his neck and arms. The secondary dose of epinephrine was working, yet the reaction had been severe enough that Deshawn knew the hospital staff would likely want to keep him under observation for at least 24 hours. Has he had any new foods in the last day or two? Deshawn asked the father. The man ran a hand through his hair, visibly distressed. No, we're usually so careful. The cookie was from a school fundraiser. The package didn't mention nuts, but his voice trailed off. Deshawn nodded. Cross-contamination happens more often than people realize. Even trace amounts can trigger reactions this severe in highly sensitive individuals. The radio crackled with Anthony's voice as he communicated with the hospital. 2 minutes out. 10-year-old male, anaphylactic shock, responding to epinephrine but airways still partially compromised. Through the small window separating the cab from the treatment area, Deshawn could see the hospital coming into view. He gave Tyler's shoulder a gentle squeeze. "You're doing great, buddy. The doctors are waiting for us and they're going to make sure you feel better." The boy's eyes, still wide with fear, seemed to hold a question. "Yes, your mom will meet us there too," Deshawn added, correctly interpreting the look. The ambulance pulled up to the emergency entrance where a team was already waiting. As soon as Anthony brought the vehicle to a stop, the back door swung open, revealing a doctor and 2 nurses ready to take over. Tyler Collins, 10 years old, severe anaphylactic reaction to nuts, Deshawn reported as they transferred the stretcher. 2 doses of epinephrine administered, 1 by parents before our arrival, 1 by us on scene. Oxygen saturation now at 92%, up from 86% initially. BP is 90-60, pulse 110. The medical team moved quickly, wheeling Tyler through the automatic doors with his father hurrying alongside. Deshawn followed with the paperwork, while Anthony stayed behind to prepare the ambulance for their next call. Inside the emergency department, organized chaos reigned as medical professionals called out orders and prepared medications. Tyler was taken to a treatment room where more monitoring equipment was attached to his small body. His mother arrived just minutes later, breathless from running from the parking lot. "How is he?" she asked, looking from the doctor to Deshawn. "He's stabilizing," the doctor explained. "We're giving him steroids and antihistamines to further reduce the swelling." The paramedics did excellent work getting the epinephrine in quickly. Deshawn stepped back, allowing the family space as the medical team continued their work. He finished writing up his report, noting all the details of their intervention. These records were crucial, not just for medical continuity, but sometimes for insurance and, in rare cases, even legal purposes. As he was completing the paperwork at the nurse's station, Deshawn felt a tap on his shoulder. It was Tyler's mother. "I just wanted to thank you," she said, her eyes still red from crying. "The doctor said if you hadn't gotten to our house so quickly and known exactly what to do." "Just doing our job, ma'am," Deshawn replied with a gentle smile. "How's he doing?" "Better. They're going to keep him overnight, but they think he'll recover completely." She hesitated, then added, "I feel so guilty. We always check everything he eats." "Don't blame yourself," Deshawn said firmly. "Food allergies are tricky and packaging isn't always clear. What matters is you had his EpiPen ready and called 911 immediately. That's what saved him." She nodded, seeming to take some comfort in his words. "The doctor also mentioned you're with Station 8. My brother-in-law was a firefighter there years ago, Joe Peterson. Did you ever work with him?" "Peterson? Tall guy always talking about fishing?" Deshawn smiled at the memory. "Sure, he trained me when I first started. Great medic." This connection seemed to relax her further, as if knowing Deshawn had trained with family somehow confirmed they'd been in good hands all along. Meanwhile, back in the Hillcrest neighborhood, Anthony was still at the Collins house, collecting the last of their equipment. As he packed up the remaining supplies, he noticed a small group of neighbors had gathered at the edge of the property. "Is everything okay?" A woman in a tennis outfit called out. "We saw the ambulance." "Medical emergency," Anthony replied professionally. "The patient has been transported to Memorial Children's." "Was it the Collins boy?" another neighbor asked. "Such a nice family." Anthony didn't respond directly, mindful of patient confidentiality. "I'm not at liberty to share details, but the situation is under control now." As he turned back to finish packing, he overheard snippets of conversation from the small. "Krautson never seen that ambulance in this neighborhood before. Not from our usual station. Didn't look like the regular paramedic, Anthony." Had grown accustomed to these kinds of comments over his 12 years on the job. As one of only 3 black paramedics at his station, he'd learned to focus on the work and ignore the rest. Still, something about the whispers made him hurry a bit more than usual. Just as he was closing the rear doors of the ambulance, a silver SUV with tinted windows slowed down in front of the house. The driver, a middle-aged woman wearing oversized sunglasses, rolled down her window. "Excuse me," she called out. "Do you work for the city ambulance service?" "Yes, ma'am," Anthony replied, showing his ID badge. "Metro Emergency Services, Unit 17. The woman studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable behind her sunglasses. "I don't recognize your unit. Were you called here specifically?" "We respond to emergencies throughout the metro area," Anthony explained patiently. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to get back to my station." As he climbed into the driver's seat, Anthony glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the woman on her phone, looking in his direction. With a slight shake of his head, he started the engine and pulled away from the curb. Back at the hospital, Deshaun had completed his paperwork and was checking on Tyler one last time before leaving. The boy looked much better. The swelling had decreased significantly and his breathing was almost normal. "Hey there," Deshaun said, standing in the doorway. "Looks like you're feeling better." Tyler nodded, managing a small smile around the oxygen cannula in his nose. "I'm heading out now, but I wanted to tell you something." Deshaun moved closer to the bed. "You were really brave today. Some adults don't stay as calm as you did when they're having trouble breathing." "Were you scared?" Tyler asked, his voice raspy. Deshaun considered the question honestly. "I wasn't scared, but I was very focused. It's like when you're playing a video game and you need to beat a tough level. You don't have time to be scared." This analogy seemed to make sense to Tyler, who nodded seriously. "Will you come back to visit?" the boy asked. "I'll try," Deshaun promised. "Maybe when you're back home and feeling better." As Deshaun walked out of the hospital, his radio buzzed. It was Anthony. "Hey, I'm on my way to pick you up. Something weird happened at the house after you left." "What kind of weird?" Deshaun asked, immediately alert. "Tell you when I get there. Should be about 5 minutes." Deshaun waited at the ambulance bay, watching the steady flow of emergency vehicles coming and going. A familiar exhaustion was setting in, the kind that always followed an intense call. Yet there was satisfaction too. Tyler would recover. The system had worked as it should. Parents recognized the emergency, called 911. Paramedics responded quickly. Hospital took over seamlessly. When Anthony pulled up, Deshaun could tell something was bothering his partner. Anthony's usual relaxed posture was gone, replaced by tension in his shoulders and jaw. "What happened?" Deshaun asked as he climbed into the passenger seat. "Nothing concrete," Anthony replied, pulling away from the hospital. "Just a feeling." Some neighbors were asking questions, and one lady in particular seemed suspicious about why we were there. Deshaun frowned. "Suspicious how?" "Like we didn't belong in that neighborhood. Asked if we were really from the city ambulance service. Wanted to know if we were called there specifically." "Seriously?" Deshaun shook his head in disbelief. "We were there saving a kid's life." "I know." Anthony sighed. "Probably nothing. But you know how it goes sometimes." Both men fell silent, all too familiar with the implied meaning. After years working together, they'd encountered various forms of suspicion and prejudice, usually subtle, occasionally blatant. Most of the time, they let it roll off their backs. The work was what mattered. "How's the kid doing?" Anthony asked, changing the subject. "Much better. They're keeping him overnight, but he'll be fine." Deshaun smiled slightly. Brave little guy. As they headed back to their station, neither man suspected that the woman's phone call would set in motion events that would challenge them in ways their paramedic training had never prepared them for. In less than an hour, Unit 17 would receive another call, one that would bring them back to the Hillcrest neighborhood, under very different circumstances. The call came through just as Anthony and Deshaun were finishing their lunch back at the station. They had been discussing Tyler's case, relieved that the boy was recovering well according to the update they'd received from the hospital. "Unit 17, we have another call in the Hillcrest neighborhood," the dispatcher's voice announced over the radio. "Possible emergency at 1428 Oak Ridge Lane. Caller reports patient may need to be transported back to the hospital." Deshaun and Anthony exchanged concerned glances. "That's the Collins address," Deshaun said, already on his feet. "Unit 17 responding," Anthony replied into the radio. "ETA 8 minutes. Can you provide additional details on the patient's condition?" "Limited information available," the dispatcher responded. Caller stated the boy's symptoms may be returning. "Parents requested your unit specifically." The two paramedics moved quickly, gathering their equipment and heading to the ambulance. Within minutes, they were back on the road, sirens blaring. Recurrent anaphylaxis isn't uncommon, Deshawn noted, reviewing Tyler's chart on their tablet. Sometimes there's a biphasic reaction hours after the initial symptoms subside. Anthony nodded, focused on navigating through traffic. The hospital released him already? Not according to this. Deshawn frowned, scrolling through the medical record. It shows he's still admitted, scheduled for release tomorrow morning. That doesn't make sense, Anthony said, slowing slightly as they approached a busy intersection. Why would the parents call us to their home if he's still at the hospital? Deshawn tried calling the hospital to confirm Tyler's status, but by the time they turned onto Oak Ridge Lane, he still hadn't gotten through to anyone who could verify the information. Something feels off, Anthony muttered as they pulled up to the Collins house. Unlike their previous visit, there was no frantic parent rushing out to meet them. The house looked quiet, almost too quiet. Let's be careful, Deshawn said as they gathered their equipment. Could be a miscommunication. They approached the front door, medical bags in hand. Deshawn rang the doorbell while Anthony scanned the surroundings. The street was eerily silent for mid-afternoon. After a moment, Mrs. Collins opened the door, her expression shifting from confusion to shock when she saw them. "What are you doing here?" she asked, looking between the two paramedics. "We received a call that Tyler was having symptoms again," Deshawn explained. "Is everything okay?" "Tyler's still at the hospital with my husband," she replied, her brow furrowed. "I just got home to pick up some clothes for him." "I didn't call for an ambulance." Anthony and Deshawn exchanged glances. "Ma'am, dispatch received a call from this address requesting Unit 17 specifically," Anthony explained. Before Mrs. Collins could respond, the sound of screeching tires drew their attention to the street. 2 police cruisers pulled up in front of the house and 4 officers emerged, weapons drawn. "Police! Step away from the door and put your hands where we can see them," one officer shouted. "What?" Deshawn turned, still holding his medical bag. "We're paramedics responding to a hands up now." "Move away from the house!" Another officer advanced toward them, his gun pointed directly at Deshawn's chest. Mrs. Collins stepped onto the porch. "Officer, these are the paramedics who saved my son this morning." "What's happening?" The police officers seemed unmoved. "Ma'am, please go back inside. We received a report of 2 suspicious men attempting to enter homes in the neighborhood." "This is ridiculous," Anthony said, slowly placing his equipment on the ground and raising his hands. "We're with Metro Emergency Services, Unit 17. We were dispatched here." "ID's in my left breast pocket," Deshawn added calmly, though his heart was racing. Years of emergency training had taught him to keep his voice steady, even when adrenaline surged through his system. One officer approached cautiously, his weapon still raised. "Don't move," he ordered as he reached for Deshawn's ID badge. Mrs. Collins stood her ground. "This is absurd. These men are paramedics. They were here this morning saving my son's life when he had an allergic reaction." "Ma'am, we're responding to a call about suspicious individuals," the officer replied, examining Deshawn's ID. "Did you call for an ambulance today?" "No, I didn't, but then why are they here?" The officer interrupted. "Someone called in a false emergency," Anthony explained, his hand still raised. "We were dispatched here to treat a child we transported earlier today. You can verify with dispatch." A second officer approached and spoke into his radio, presumably to check their story. Meanwhile, the first officer instructed Anthony and Deshawn to face the ambulance and place their hands on the hood. "This is completely unnecessary," Deshawn said, his professional demeanor intact despite the humiliation of being treated like a criminal in front of a patient's family. "Just following protocol." "Sir?" the officer replied, beginning to pat down Deshawn while his partner did the same to Anthony. Mrs. Collins had pulled out her phone. "I'm calling my husband at the hospital. This is outrageous. Ma'am, please stay where you are until we sort this out," one of the officers called to her. The situation grew more tense as neighbors began to emerge from their homes, watching the scene unfold. Deshawn could see curtains twitching in windows and people standing on porches witnessing their detainment. "Our ambulance has tracking," Anthony told the officer searching him. "You can verify our location and dispatch call. This is wasting valuable time when we could be responding to real emergencies." The radio on one of the officer's shoulders crackled to life. After listening for a moment, his posture relaxed slightly. "Dispatch confirms Unit 17 was called to this address for a medical emergency," he informed his colleagues. "They're checking why the call was placed if the patient is at the hospital. I told you," Mrs. Collins said, her voice trembling with a mixture of relief and anger. These men are heroes who saved my son, and now they're being treated like criminals on my property. The officer who had been speaking with dispatch approached Deshawn and Anthony. You can lower your hands. Sorry for the misunderstanding, but we had to respond to the report. Deshawn turned around slowly, his face composed but his eyes reflecting the weight of the moment. What exactly was reported, officer? A call came in about 2 men in uniform attempting to enter homes in the neighborhood, claiming to be paramedics. The officer explained, now looking somewhat uncomfortable. The caller specifically mentioned your unit number and described your vehicle. Anthony shook his head in disbelief. So someone saw us respond to a legitimate emergency this morning, then called in a false report about us? It appears that way, the officer admitted. We're required to respond to all calls. Mrs. Collins had moved closer, her phone still in hand. My husband is furious. He wants to know who made this false report. We don't release caller information, ma'am, the officer replied. But we will document that this was a false alarm. By now, a small crowd of neighbors had gathered at the edge of the Collins property. Deshawn noticed the woman in the silver SUV from earlier, standing slightly apart from the others, watching intently. We still need to understand why we were called back here, Deshawn said, returning to the professional matter at hand. Someone reported that your son needed medical attention. The officer with the radio spoke up again. Dispatch says the caller identified herself as Mrs. Collins and said her son was having breathing problems again. All eyes turned to the woman in question, who shook her head emphatically. I did not make that call. I've been at the hospital all day. I just came home 20 minutes ago to get fresh clothes. So someone impersonated you to get us here, Anthony said slowly, and then someone else reported us as suspicious. The implications hung in the air, uncomfortable and undeniable. Deshawn and Anthony exchanged a glance that communicated volumes without words. After years as partners, they could read each other's thoughts in situations like this. We need to get back in service, Deshawn said finally, picking up his medical bag from where he'd placed it on the ground. Mrs. Collins, please let us know if you need anything else for Tyler. I'm so sorry this happened, she replied, her eyes glistening. This isn't right. As the paramedics walked back to their ambulance, the police officers conferred among themselves. One approached Deshawn just as he reached the vehicle. For what it's worth, we were just doing our job, the officer said quietly. No hard feelings? Deshawn looked at him for a long moment. We were just doing our job too, officer. Saving a child's life. Inside the ambulance, Anthony took a deep breath before starting the engine. You okay? Fine, Deshawn replied, his voice tight. Let's just get back to the station. As they pulled away, neither man spoke about what had just happened. They didn't need to. It wasn't the first time, and they both knew it wouldn't be the last. But something about this incident, the deliberate nature of it, the public humiliation in front of a patient's family, the wasted emergency resources, felt particularly pointed. What they didn't realize as they drove away was that Mrs. Collins was still standing on her porch, watching them leave with a newfound understanding of what these men faced while trying to do their jobs. And she wasn't the only one. Several neighbors had witnessed the entire scene, including a local journalist who happened to be visiting his parents across the street. The story of what happened on Oak Ridge Lane was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning to unfold in ways that would eventually reach far beyond the borders of Hillcrest. The drive back to the station was silent, both men lost in their own thoughts. Deshawn stared out the window, his jaw clenched tight. Anthony gripped the steering wheel with more force than necessary, his knuckles white against the black surface. Just as they turned onto Main Street, their radio crackled urgently. Unit 17, we have an emergency at Memorial Children's Hospital. 10-year-old male experiencing severe secondary anaphylactic reaction. Hospital staff requesting your assistance specifically. Code 3. Anthony and Deshawn exchanged quick glances, immediately recognizing the description. Tyler, Deshawn said as Anthony flipped on the sirens and made a sharp U-turn. Unit 17 responding, Anthony replied into the radio. ETA 12 minutes. Despite what had just happened in the Hillcrest neighborhood, both men shifted seamlessly back into professional mode. Personal feelings would have to wait. A child needed them. Secondary reaction, Deshawn murmured, reviewing what they knew, probably biphasic anaphylaxis. Happens in about 20% of severe cases. Anthony nodded, weaving through traffic with practiced precision. Why would they call us specifically? The hospital has their own emergency team. Not sure, Deshawn replied, checking their supplies to ensure they had everything they might need. But it must be serious if they're calling for backup. As they raced toward the hospital, Deshawn's phone rang. It was Dr. Chen, the attending physician who had taken over Tyler's care that morning. Deshawn, thank goodness you answered, she said, her voice tight with tension. Tyler's having a severe biphasic reaction. His airways are closing rapidly, and we're having trouble stabilizing him. His father mentioned you two handled the initial response perfectly. We could use your expertise. We're on our way, about 8 minutes out, Deshawn assured her. What treatments have you administered so far? As Dr. Chen listed the medications and procedures they'd attempted, Deshawn jotted notes on his tablet, his mind already formulating additional approaches. His father also mentioned something about an incident at their house, Dr. Chen added. He seems quite upset about something involving you two. It's a long story, Deshawn replied. We'll fill you in later. For now, try increasing the epinephrine dose and prepare for possible intubation if his O2 stats don't improve before we arrive. When they finally pulled up to the emergency entrance, a nurse was waiting to escort them directly to Tyler's room. The scene inside was controlled chaos. Medical staff moved urgently around the small body on the bed, monitors beeping in alarming patterns. Tyler's face was swollen again, worse than before, and his lips had taken on a bluish tint that made both paramedics move faster. Mr. Collins stood against the wall, his face ashen as he watched the medical team work. When he saw Anthony and Deshawn, relief washed over his features. You're here, he said. Thank God. My wife called and told me what happened at our house. I'm so sorry. No time for that now, sir, Anthony said gently, guiding him further from the bed to make room. We need to focus on Tyler. Dr. Chen looked up as they approached. His condition deteriorated rapidly about 20 minutes ago. We've given 3 doses of epinephrine, but his airways are still closing. Deshawn moved to the bedside, speaking calmly to Tyler, even as he assessed the boy's condition. Hey buddy, we're back. Remember us from this morning? We're going to help you breathe better again. Tyler's eyes, wide with panic, fixed on Deshawn's face. There was recognition there and perhaps a glimmer of trust. Oxygen saturation is dropping, a nurse reported, down to 78%. We need to intubate, Dr. Chen said, reaching for the necessary equipment. Wait, Deshawn said, his voice carrying quiet authority. I've seen this pattern before. The standard protocol isn't working because this isn't a standard case. All eyes turned to him. Tyler's having a refractory reaction, Deshawn explained. The epinephrine pathway is saturated. We need to try a different approach. He turned to Anthony, who was already reaching into their specialized kit. Magnesium sulfate and continuous albuterol, plus a higher concentration epinephrine push delivered through a central line rather than IM. Dr. Chen hesitated only briefly before nodding. Do it. What followed was a precisely coordinated dance between the hospital staff and the 2 paramedics. Despite having just come from a situation where their professional identities had been questioned at gunpoint, Anthony and Deshawn worked with steady hands and clear minds. Central line is in, Anthony reported. Pushing epinephrine now, Deshawn said. Start the magnesium drip. The minutes that followed were tense. All eyes alternating between Tyler's face and the monitors tracking his vital signs. Mr. Collins had moved closer again, his hand resting gently on his son's foot, the only spot he could reach without interfering with the medical equipment. Come on, Tyler, he whispered. You can do this. At first, there seemed to be no change. The boy's oxygen levels continued to hover at dangerously low levels and his pulse raced erratically. But then, almost imperceptibly, the numbers on the monitor began to shift in the right direction. Oxygen saturation 83%, 86%, 89%, the nurse called out. The swelling around Tyler's eyes had begun to subside, and his breathing, while still labored, no longer had the desperate quality of someone drowning in air. It's working, Dr. Chen said, relief evident in her voice. Good call. Deshawn nodded but kept his focus entirely on his patient. Tyler, you're doing great. Keep breathing nice and slow for me. The boy managed a tiny nod, his eyes never leaving Deshawn's face. As the crisis began to recede, the atmosphere in the room gradually relaxed. The additional medical staff who had rushed in to assist began to filter out, returning to their other duties. After 20 more minutes of careful monitoring, Tyler's condition had stabilized enough that he was out of immediate danger. "We'll need to keep him in the PICU for at least 48 hours, Dr. Chen told Mr. Collins, "and we'll be consulting with an immunologist about adjusting his emergency medication protocol." Mr. Collins nodded, tears of relief shining in his eyes. "Thank you, all of you." His gaze lingered on Anthony and Deshawn. "Especially you two. That's twice today you've saved my son." As the hospital staff prepared to transfer Tyler to the pediatric intensive care unit, Dr. Chen pulled Deshawn and Anthony aside. "That was impressive work," she said. "Where did you learn that protocol for refractory anaphylaxis?" "It's not in our standard procedures. Medical conference in Boston last year," Deshawn explained. "There was a presentation on unusual anaphylactic patterns in pediatric patients. The speaker had success with the magnesium sulfate approach in cases where standard treatments failed." Dr. Chen nodded appreciatively. "I'm going to look into that. We might need to update our protocols." She hesitated, then added, "Mr. Collins mentioned something about an incident at their home? Something about the police?" Anthony and Deshawn exchanged glances. It was Deshawn who finally answered. "We received a false call back to their house. Someone reported that Tyler needed emergency transport. When we arrived, we were confronted by police officers responding to a report of suspicious individuals." Dr. Chen's expression shifted from confusion to understanding, and then to anger. "You mean someone called you out there just to—" "It appears that way," Anthony confirmed quietly. "And then you came straight here to save this child again?" She shook her head in disbelief. "I don't have words. It's the job," Deshawn said simply. Mr. Collins approached them, having overheard part of the conversation. "It's not just the job. What you two did, not just for Tyler, but how you handled everything, it's beyond professional. My wife is filing a formal complaint about what happened at our house. This should never have occurred. We appreciate that." "Sir," Anthony replied, "but right now, we're just glad Tyler is stable." As they prepared to leave, Tyler, now secured to a transport gurney, reached out his hand toward Deshawn. The paramedic moved closer, bending down to hear the boy's whispered words. "You came back," Tyler said, his voice raspy but clear. Deshawn smiled. "I promised I would, didn't I?" Outside the hospital, as they walked back to their ambulance, both men finally allowed themselves to feel the full weight of the day's events. "You okay?" Anthony asked, echoing his question from earlier. This time, Deshawn gave a more honest answer. "Not really. But we did good work today." "That helps," Anthony nodded in understanding. "What do you think will happen with the complaint?" "I don't know," Deshawn replied. "But something feels different about this time." What neither man realized as they climbed back into Unit 17 was just how different things would be. Already, Mrs. Collins had spoken to 3 news outlets. The journalist who had witnessed their detainment was writing an article for the city's largest newspaper. And hospital staff, hearing about what had transpired between saving a child's life twice, were sharing the story with increasing outrage. The incident that began as a routine emergency call was about to spark a conversation that would extend far beyond one neighborhood or one hospital. But for now, Anthony and Deshawn were simply focused on completing their shift and responding to the next call, whoever and wherever it might be. 3 weeks had passed since the incident in the Hillcrest neighborhood. Tyler Collins was back home and recovering well, with a new and more comprehensive allergy action plan. The story of what had happened to Deshawn and Anthony, however, had taken on a life of its own. It began with a front-page article in the city newspaper. Paramedics detained at gunpoint after saving child's life. The journalist who had witnessed the confrontation from across the street wrote a detailed account that left little room for misinterpretation. Photos showed the 2 paramedics with their hands on the hood of their ambulance, while police officers searched them. What made the story particularly powerful were the quotes from Mrs. Collins. "These men saved my son's life, then were treated like criminals on my property, simply because of how they look. And then, after all that, they returned to the hospital to save my son a second time without a word of complaint." By the end of the first week, 3 local TV stations had picked up the story. Hospital staff had come forward to confirm that Anthony and Deshawn had indeed rushed directly from being detained to perform a life-saving intervention at the hospital. The police department issued a carefully worded statement about following protocol in response to community reports, which only seemed to fuel more outrage. Through it all, Anthony and Deshawn continued their shifts with quiet professionalism. They declined interview requests and kept their focus on the work, though they couldn't help noticing the changed atmosphere. Patients looked at them with newfound respect. Colleagues from other stations sent messages of support, even some police. Officers made a point of greeting them warmly at emergency scenes. "This is getting out of hand," Deshawn said as they drove back from a call, gesturing at a billboard that had appeared overnight. It showed a stylized image of two paramedics with the words, "Heroes come in all colors," emblazoned across the top. Anthony shook his head. "I know. My aunt called yesterday to say she saw us on the national news." "National?" Deshawn groaned. "Great." Their captain had been protective, filtering interview requests and adjusting their schedule to give them more calls in other neighborhoods. But even he couldn't shield them from the growing movement their experience had sparked. The most unexpected development came 10 days after the incident, when a formal letter arrived at the station from the Hillcrest Neighborhood Association. It wasn't, as many had expected, a complaint. Instead, it was an invitation. The Hillcrest community would like to formally recognize paramedics Anthony Rodriguez and Deshawn Miller for their extraordinary service and professionalism. The letter read, "We are organizing a community gathering in the park this Sunday and would be honored by your attendance." "You going to go?" Anthony asked after Deshawn had read the letter aloud. Deshawn folded the paper carefully. "I don't know. Feels like it might be awkward." "Mrs. Collins called me yesterday," Anthony admitted. "She said Tyler keeps asking when he can see us again. Said it would mean a lot to him." That, more than anything else, tipped the scale. By Sunday afternoon, both men found themselves driving toward the park in the center of Hillcrest, neither in uniform but both feeling strangely exposed. What they discovered upon arrival left them speechless. At least 200 people had gathered in the park. Banners hung between trees with messages of gratitude and support. A stage had been set up at one end with a podium and chairs. "I didn't sign up for this," Deshawn muttered as they walked toward the crowd. "Did you?" "No way," Anthony replied under his breath. "But we're here now." A ripple of recognition moved through the gathering as they approached. Then, unexpectedly, people began to applaud. The sound swelled, accompanied by cheers and whistles. Mr. and Mrs. Collins hurried over to greet them, Tyler between them looking much healthier than the last time they'd seen him. "Thank you for coming," Mrs. Collins said, squeezing each man's hand. "This means so much to everyone here." "We didn't expect all this," Deshawn replied, gesturing to the crowd. "Neither did we, honestly," Mr. Collins admitted. "It started as a small thank you gathering, but then more people wanted to be involved. The whole neighborhood has been talking about what happened." Tyler, who had been hanging back shyly, finally stepped forward. "I made something for you," he said, holding out 2 handmade cards. "Mom helped with the spelling." Deshawn and Anthony accepted the cards, each decorated with a childish but heartfelt drawing of an ambulance and the words, "My Heroes," written in uneven letters. "This is great, buddy," Deshawn said, kneeling to Tyler's level. "How are you feeling?" "Better," Tyler replied. "The doctor said I have to carry 2 EpiPens now instead of 1. And I got this." He proudly displayed a medical alert bracelet on his wrist. "Very responsible." Anthony nodded approvingly. Before they could continue their conversation, the president of the neighborhood association approached and asked them to come to the stage. Despite their reluctance to be in the spotlight, they found themselves following her to the front of the gathering. What followed was unlike anything either man had experienced in their careers. One by one, community members came to the microphone to speak. The first was an elderly woman who lived across from the Collins family. "I witnessed what happened that day," she said, her voice quavering with emotion. "I saw these brave men treated like criminals in front of a house where they had just saved a child. I've lived in this neighborhood for 43 years, and I've never felt so ashamed of our community." A middle-aged man spoke next. "I was the one who called the police," he admitted, to gasps from the crowd. "I didn't see the first ambulance visit. I only saw what I thought were strangers approaching a neighbor's house." I made a judgment based on appearance, and I was wrong. I'm publicly apologizing to these paramedics and to the Collins family." The police chief stepped up next, his expression solemn. "What happened that day has forced our department to re-examine our response protocols. We've already implemented changes to how we handle community reports and verify emergency personnel identities. These changes will be named the Rodriguez-Miller protocols in honor of these two paramedics." As speaker after speaker took the microphone, Anthony and Deshawn sat quietly, increasingly moved by the outpouring of support and the concrete changes their experience had prompted. The most powerful moment came when Tyler himself asked to speak. Standing on a step stool to reach the microphone, his voice small but clear, he said simply, "They saved me twice, and they were nice to me when I was scared. That's what heroes do." By the time the formal portion of the gathering concluded, something had shifted, not just in the atmosphere of the event, but in the community itself. People who had never spoken to each other were engaged in conversation. Children were asking questions about what had happened and why. Several community members were signing up for a newly announced CPR and emergency response class. Mrs. Collins approached Deshawn and Anthony as they mingled with the crowd afterward. "Something good has come from this terrible experience," she said. "Look around. These conversations wouldn't have happened otherwise." She was right. All around them, people were engaged in discussions about race, perception, and community safety. Conversations that were uncomfortable, but necessary. "We've also raised enough money to fund a scholarship program," Mrs. Collins continued, "for minority students interested in emergency services careers. We're calling it the Unit 17 Scholarship." "That's really not necessary," Anthony began. "It's not just about you two," she interrupted gently. "It's about changing the future, making sure there are more Deshawn's and Anthony's out there." As the afternoon wore on, the gathering transitioned into a community picnic. Deshawn found himself talking with a group of teenagers who were curious about careers in emergency services. Anthony was surrounded by parents asking questions about first aid for children with allergies. Later, as they were preparing to leave, the woman who had made the false report approached them hesitantly. She had been conspicuously absent from the speakers. "I want to apologize," she said, unable to meet their eyes. "I saw you at the house that morning and I made assumptions I shouldn't have." "Why call us back there?" Deshawn asked, the question that had bothered him for weeks. "Why not just report what you thought you saw?" She looked down. "I wanted to be sure. I thought if you came back and there was no emergency, it would prove you weren't real paramedics." The logic was so flawed, so wrapped in layers of prejudice, that neither man knew quite how to respond. But they didn't need to. Mr. Collins, who had overheard, stepped forward. "Your actions could have cost my son his life," he said quietly. "While these men were being detained because of your call, Tyler was having a second reaction at the hospital. Minutes mattered." The woman paled. "I didn't know." "No, you didn't," Mrs. Collins interjected. "That's the point." 6 months later, the changes sparked by that day continued to ripple outward. The Rodriguez-Miller protocols had been adopted by police departments in 3 neighboring cities. The Unit 17 scholarship had its first recipient. Most importantly, emergency response times in Hillcrest and similar neighborhoods had improved as community members learned to recognize and respect the work of first responders of all backgrounds. And every few weeks, Tyler Collins would spot a familiar ambulance driving through his neighborhood, not on an emergency call, but making a friendly visit to a boy who now dreamed of becoming a paramedic himself someday.